mention. Okay. So how did I become a salt marsh scientist? I have always had a strong interest in the outdoors, loved playing outside, getting dirty. But I think what really solidified my interest in marine science was a high school trip to the Galapagos. And so naturally, I chose a college that had no marine science program, but that did help kind of solidify and drive my future career in research. I went to Clark University for my undergrad and master's, and I began working with a professor who had a salt marsh project studying the effect of nitrogen fertilization on the photosynthetic performance of these salt marsh grasses. And that became the topic of my master's thesis. And since then, I've worked in marshes in Louisiana and Massachusetts for the past 10 years. And I truly just love this ecosystem. And so I'm hoping to convince you all of that same thing today. So just a really broad overview to catch us all up to speed. What are salt marshes? They are this ecosystem that lies at a critical interface between the land and the sea. And they're defined by their grasses, which we all see when you look out at a salt marsh. They're also defined by their sediment. Their sediment is made up of decomposing organic matter that forms what we call peat. And that peat is really important to form the structure of that marsh platform. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that peat today. And salt marshes also are defined by their flooding on incoming tides. They experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. And majority of those tides flood some, if not all, of that salt marsh. So it makes it a really fluctuating environment in terms of temperature, salinity, moisture. So a lot of these grasses and animals that have lived there have adapted to living in these kind of fluctuating environments. Salt marshes dominate the coastlines worldwide, particularly the coast of North America. This slide here just shows a nice representation of the distribution of salt marshes in Massachusetts. And so we see here, this is north of Boston, Newbury, Raleigh area. This is called the Great Marsh. And we have another smaller Great Marsh here in Barnstable. And so here we are down in Falmouth. We have a small smattering of marshes around Falmouth and Cape Cod. So why are salt marshes important? Not only are they beautiful ecosystems to look at and recreate in, but they are important because they protect coastlines by buffering against storms. They retain and recycle nutrients. So salt marshes are typically considered a nitrogen sponge. And what that means is they take up nitrogen that is derived from land sources or river inputs. They take up that nitrogen and incorporate it into their plant biomass. They can also use it in food webs. And then really importantly is this process called denitrification. So a service that marshes provide is they are able to transform nitrogen that has run off from, agriculture or septic systems, and they can transform it and emit it back to the atmosphere as an inert gas. So this is a major nitrogen removal step that is critical for reducing the amount of nitrogen that reaches our open oceans. Salt marshes also store large amounts of carbon. So what that means is that they have high rates of primary productivity, absorbing carbon dioxide from the environment, and they store it either in their plant tissue, above ground biomass, or deep in the soils. And so what I want to point out is that salt marshes actually store more carbon on a per hectare basis than forests, especially rainforests, which I think we all typically think of as major carbon stores. So that's a really important feature of salt marshes that we need to protect. Salt marshes are also important nursery grounds and habitat for many organisms. So here's a close-up of some of these organisms that we find in salt marshes. They're home to many birds. This is a picture of the salt marsh sparrow. Salt marsh sparrows are actually a vulnerable species because they lay their eggs in nests up on the high marsh platform. And unfortunately, due to elevation loss and sea level rise, a lot of these nests are drowning, and we're losing salt marsh sparrow populations because these nests aren't able to hatch. And so this is going to be important. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on as one of the benefits of runnels. Some other organisms you might find in the salt marsh, there's lots of invertebrates like these periwinkle snails, amphipods, isopods, insects like spiders. We have a couple different crab species. Here's a picture of a blue crab. My favorite is this little charismatic mummichog. These are fish that maybe are like 2 inches big at their adult size. And these fish are pretty cool. They rely on the high marsh flooding tides to eat their high protein prey. So once a month, the full entire marsh platform will flood, and the mummichogs will ride that water in, and they prey on all the organisms that live on the high marsh, and then they drain back out with the ebbing tide. And then lastly are our cord grasses. So again, this is one of the things that characterizes salt marshes. And these cord grasses are very important for a number of reasons. So here's a picture of the zonation patterns that typical salt marshes exhibit. You have the low marsh species are typically Spartina alterniflora. That's your main salt marsh cordgrass. And then the high marsh have a little bit less flooding tolerant and salinity tolerant plants that grow up on the high marsh because it's not flooded as often. The low marsh Spartina alterniflora has adapted to living in higher inundation and high salinity areas. For example, they can expel salt through their leaves, and they can also transport oxygen to their below ground root structures. So when we think about sea level rise and changing hydrology, we need to think about the different tolerances of these different marsh grasses. So salt marsh vegetation not only provides habitat, as I mentioned, for the salt marsh sparrow, for all those organisms that we saw on the previous slide. What's also cool is during those really high flooding tide, the amphipods and isopods and spiders all crawl up this vegetation to avoid being drowned, right? So they're very important for that. As I mentioned too, these grasses have high primary productivity. So that means they absorb a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and store it in either their grass tissue or their below ground tissue. Salt marshes are also really important for increasing elevation through a process called accretion. And what that means is they either serve as a filtration, basically, whereas the sediment from incoming tidal water is trapped by the vegetation and it settles on the marsh platform, helping it accrete elevation. And they also help increase elevation by putting that carbon into the below ground structures as peat. And so lastly, and most importantly from this talk, I want you to take away is that they have these intense compact below ground structures. So this is a picture of salt marsh, a Spartina alterniflora below ground root and rhizome structure. And so these root and rhizomes are really important for stabilizing that salt marsh peat. If we start to lose and have deterioration of those roots and rhizomes, the peat is not as firm and we can get erosion of that salt marsh sediment. And so I want you to, if you can, remember this picture as we're going through the talk today in terms of consequences for vegetation loss on overall marsh health. So unfortunately, there are many threats to salt marshes because they lie at that critical interface between the land and the sea. One specific threat is nutrient pollution. So as I mentioned, salt marshes are nitrogen sinks. They are able to absorb nitrogen to a certain extent. But this was a study done in Plum Island where they found that excess nitrogen actually weakened the below ground structure of those plants and made them more susceptible to sea level rise. And you can see the slumping of the creek bank and some cracking of the creek bank as well. There's a number of problematic species that inhabit the marsh. There's a couple different crab species, and those are problematic because they both feed on the vegetation and they also create burrows and aeration that weaken that marsh platform. This picture on the left is Phragmites. It's a reed that grows in more fresher water, but it grows in these really dense stands on the upland border of salt marshes. And so this really limits marsh migration ability of that Spartina to move landward because they can't compete with that Phragmites. And lastly, hydrology alterations are threatening marshes. This is in the form of sea level rise, as you can see from the picture on the left. This is causing longer inundation times for those salt marsh grasses, which are either going to have to increase their elevation gain to keep up with sea level rise or migrate landward. And then we're also seeing the emergence of these bare areas of shallow standing water. And so that's going to be sort of the focus of what we're going to talk about today. There's a body of scientific research that explains this ideal dynamic equilibrium where you have a natural cycle of pond formation and then recovery, which results in no net marsh loss. And what happens is we have a healthy marsh system that experiences some sort of disturbance. This can be either a storm or ice event. We could have dead rack plant material, which suffocates vegetation and causes vegetation death. So anything that causes vegetation death is going to result in these lower elevation areas that start pooling water. And eventually, so remember that picture of the roots, without that root system to trap sediment and increase elevation and hold that peat together, the pond and the bare area is going to steadily erode and expand. And the idea is that it erodes and expands until it interacts with a natural tidal channel or a mosquito ditch, at which point it will drain all the standing water and the vegetation will be able to regrow because the conditions are dry enough. So this is great. However, it depends on a lot of different factors, including rates of sea level rise, rates of sediment supply, so how much sediment is coming in from that tidal water, also elevation and tidal range, and then historic human impacts, which I'll touch on in a couple slides. Unfortunately, we are seeing in the Northeast the emergence of these interior areas of shallow standing water. As I've pictured here, these areas of kind of darker color are areas where the vegetation is gone and pools. And some of these are ponds. Ponds kind of are more established. They're kind of like standing water. And so that's led us to believe that marshes are no longer in this dynamic equilibrium. When you have that flooding stress that causes vegetation death, you're going to see more peat collapse. And so when that happens, two different scenarios can occur. One is marsh drowning. This tends to occur when sea level rise is greater than 10 millimeters per year. And that occurs when the entire marsh platform's elevation gain or accretion rates are lower than sea level rise, right? So they're not able to maintain their elevation fast enough as sea levels are rising. The second scenario is pool deepening, and this occurs at lower sea level rise rates. And this scenario just involves the pond deepening because the pond itself is not able to maintain its elevation in relation to sea level rise, but the rest of the marsh platform is, so it stays relatively intact. And so what I want to point out is the global estimate of sea level rise is around 3.6 millimeters per year. Now that's an average. So some marshes are experiencing higher rates and some lower rates. But overall, we are experiencing more of this pool deepening and pond expansion on the high marsh platform, which is becoming an important mechanism for marsh loss. So you can see here lots of pictures of those interior ponds and vegetation loss. So I mentioned historical modification. So in addition to natural disturbances such as sea level rise and storms, humans have also been impacting marshes dating back centuries. A number of farming practices have long-lasting effects on salt marsh hydrology. For example, pictured here, embankments, you can kind of see this little light lines. These are raised structures that farmers installed in the marsh to block out the salt water and to help pool fresh water to help with their agriculture or to give fresh water to their cattle. Farmers also dug ditches to also help drain the marsh so they could harvest the salt marsh hay, the high marsh grasses. And then they took those sediment spoils from digging the ditches and place them on the marsh. And so we are seeing lasting impacts of those topographic changes at how the marsh tide is draining off the marsh. And then in the 1930s, the government instituted a mosquito ditching project where they dug thousands of mosquito ditches all across marshes to help drain standing water and reduce breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And unfortunately, the problem with mosquito ditches now is they're often filling in and they're called ditch plugs. And so that's also prohibiting drainage of these shallow standing water features. And then lastly, infrastructure such as roads or upland development is also altering how much groundwater and the types of groundwater that are running off into the marsh. So back to our dynamic equilibrium and the need for hydrologic restoration, because we're no longer getting this natural drainage. So that brings me to introducing you to runnels, which is our new hydrologic restoration strategy. So runnels are these shallow channels that are dug in the marsh, and the idea behind them is to drain that standing water off the marsh platform and create conditions that are suitable for revegetation. So it's a delicate balance because you don't want to overdrain the sediment, right? One thing that I forgot to mention was that another defining feature of marshes is this dampness. They're wet, and that moisture helps with a number of different biogeochemical processes, which I'll also touch on a little bit later. So these runnels are dug about 1 foot by 1 foot. Their length can vary depending on how close your pool is to a natural tidal channel. Runnels were introduced in the 1980s in Australia as a tool to drain standing water and reduce mosquito breeding grounds. And recently, especially in the Northeast, they've become a tool for restoring hydrology and encouraging revegetation. And this schematic is just to show you really how small those runnels are. As I mentioned, they're not larger than 1 foot wide by 1 foot deep. We try not to penetrate below the rooting zone of the vegetation, again, to maintain some of that natural moisture that the plants do need and that some of these biogeochemical processes rely on. In recent years, there's been a number of successful runnel projects in the area. Colleagues at Buzzards Bay Coalition, Towson University, and Woodwell Climate Institute installed a series of runnels over in Dartmouth and Fairhaven in Buzzards Bay. And you can see in the top picture here, before the runnels were installed, you can see extensive ponding and standing shallow water and vegetation loss. And they found within almost 1 whole year after installing runnels, you can see at the bottom here that a lot of that water has drained and the vegetation has grown back in just 1 year. This is another study that was done in Plum Island, so in the Great Marsh north of Boston. This is a much different tidal range. Our tides in Waquoit Bay and in Buzzards Bay are microtidal, so they're very small. Here in Plum Island, they're macrotidal, so much larger. And so you can see in 2014, these dark areas are those areas that have lost vegetation and have standing water. And 7 years later, this green that has grown back in is that revegetation. So 2 examples of really successful runnel projects. And when I say successful, they're successful at restoring vegetation, but we still don't know a lot about how they change other characteristics of the marsh, specifically biogeochemical processes and just overall moisture and sediment characteristics. I snuck this in here too, just to tell you another benefit of runnels. So as I mentioned, the salt marsh sparrows nest up on that high marsh platform. And so we are able to take some of the sediment from the digging of the runnels and place it on the marsh platform. And we place it in very, very thin layers, but just enough to raise the elevation in hopes that we can encourage those salt marsh sparrows to nest there. And there have been a few examples of successful nesting on peat placement from these runnel projects. So when talking to Megan, the research coordinator here at Waquoit, she noticed that a particular marsh has been increasing its vegetation loss in areas of shallow standing water. And I will orient you to where we are. So Waquoit Bay. Here in the south, we have Sage Lot Pond and South Cape Beach, and the marsh in question is Doghead Marsh, aptly named because it's shaped like a dog's head. So I'm going to show you these are aerial photos of the expansion of these areas of vegetation loss. So really the whole area sees a large expansion in 16 years, so from 2005 to 2021. But if you would like to just focus on that arrow, it shows a pretty good example of a pool that expanded and deepened. So here we'll start in 2005, 2010, 2019, and then finally 2021. So you can see that this marsh could probably use some hydrologic restoration. So we went out and we did extensive site scoping, and we chose 5 pools that we thought could benefit from runnel remediation. And we had four-ish criteria for our choices. We wanted to find pools that were relatively shallow. We were trying to avoid long established ponds. Ponds are harder to drain because typically they're deeper. They don't have as much healthy edge vegetation. They've been just around longer. So we were trying to find relatively new pools that had formed. So they had to be relatively shallow. They had to have sloping edges. Again, that's another characteristic of ponds, that they are very steep edges. It means they've been established for a long time. And same with firm peat. The idea behind having firm peat is that there's still hopefully some below ground organic matter in there, which will just make restoration easier once that marsh is drained, and hopefully the vegetation can regrow. And then having healthy edge vegetation is also going to help once you dry that marsh sediment to encourage that vegetation to regrow. So these are 5 pictures of the pools that we chose. They vary in size, but they all kind of fit those 4 parameters that I just mentioned. And those white kind of poles in the middle of the pools are our water level logger wells. And so we have water level loggers that we're continually monitoring the water level changes in those pools. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the results from our preliminary study that we did in 2023. All my figures are going to be oriented the same way. So the pooled sites, these are our areas of standing water and vegetation death, are going to be in blue, and our healthy marsh sites are going to be in green. So first, starting with percent vegetation, we found that healthy marsh sites were 83% vegetated, while those pooled sites were only 35% vegetated. So these healthy sites have more than double the vegetation than the pooled sites do. This is just another way of looking at those same results. The orange is bare and the brown is dead, and the different greens are just different vegetation types. But I wanted to show this figure because it really highlights that these pool sites have almost 4 times as much bare and dead vegetation or bare sediment as compared to the healthy sites. Okay, so we visually see it, but now we can put some numbers on the fact that we really have lost a lot of this vegetation. I'm also going to introduce a study that I did in 2022. I traveled to 11 marshes in New England, from Rhode Island to Plum Island, north of Boston. And these sites were sites that have received runnels either from 2 years ago to 9 years ago. And the goal was to look at, again, the difference between these degraded pooled sites and the healthy marsh, and then try to understand how the runnel has either helped recover some of these parameters or not. So from my spatial study, we found very similar results as in Doghead. The healthy marsh were 80% vegetated, while the pooled sites were only 28% vegetated. But I did find that at the runnel sites, the vegetation coverage increased to 42%. So we see that the runnels are increasing vegetation cover over time. They're not fully returned. Some of them have returned fully to their reference values, but there's still a little bit of a ways to go. Moving on to organic matter. So organic matter is the dead plant and animal material that's at various stages of decomposing below ground in that peat. And so we found that the healthy marsh had slightly higher organic matter content than the pooled sites. And this is promising to me because it means that these pooled sites haven't degraded too much. There's still some firm below ground organic matter content in there that will help make them good candidates for restoration. And if we look at the results from my spatial study, I found the same thing. The healthy marsh had higher percent organic matter than the pooled sites. And runnels slightly increased that organic matter over time. Again, this could be because the vegetation is regrowing, which helps produce more organic matter below ground. One thing I was also interested in is decomposition. So I think I've mentioned that because marshes store a lot of carbon, or they store a lot of carbon because they have low rates of decomposition. Decomposition is the process of breaking down this organic matter and releasing carbon back to the atmosphere. Okay, so because they have low rates, they are able to store a lot of carbon. This process is highly dependent on oxygen availability of the sediment. So one of my questions is, if we are runneling these sites and all of a sudden draining that marsh and oxygenating the sediment, are we going to stimulate decomposition, which would be a bad thing because it would put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I did a preliminary study where I buried salt marsh grasses in the marsh here at Doghead, and I measured their decomposition rate over time. And what I found was that the healthy marsh actually had slightly higher rates of decomposition than the pooled site. This could be because that reference healthy marsh, it does drain and get some oxygenation into the sediment, more so than the pooled sites. It could also be because there's just more organic matter available in those healthy marshes, so the microbes are just more active. So I don't have any other data from my spatial study, but it'll be interesting to see how these rates of decomposition change once we install runnels. Okay, and then lastly, a really important parameter of the marsh that I've been talking about is their oxidation. And we measure this as in a term called redox potential. It's basically the reduction oxidation potential of the sediment. It just is how much oxygen is in the peat. And so anything above 0 is considered aerobic, so oxygen rich, and anything below 0 is anaerobic or oxygen poor. And so what we found at Doghead is that this was overall a very saturated site. But we did see that the healthy marsh has slightly higher oxygen content than the pooled site. This could be, again, because they experience daily tidal flushing, or it could be because they have that healthy vegetation that they are able to send oxygen below ground. And then if we go back to my spatial study, we found the same thing. We found that these sites were overall just more oxygenated, but the healthy marsh had much higher oxygen content than the pooled sites. And runnel sites actually increased sediment oxidation, but not as much as I expected. And this is a promising result, right? So one of our fears is that we are going to over-oxygenate these sediments if you over-runnel. If you dig too deep and drain too fast, one of our fears is that you're going to oxygenate the sediment. So this to me is a promising result, that you can find this balance between drainage to encourage revegetation while maintaining moisture that's necessary for some of these biogeochemical processes. So I've mentioned nitrogen cycling, and I'm going to just revisit it really quick. I know this is a really crazy figure, but all I want you to take away from this is that there's a number of nitrogen processes that are reliant on oxygen, so anything above the dotted line in white. And there's a couple that actually are inhibited by oxygen, so below the dotted line. And the one that is most important is back to that denitrification, right? That's where they take nitrogen, the microbes convert it to an inert gas and emit it back to the atmosphere. This process actually won't occur in the presence of oxygen. So again, one of my questions is, if we are draining the marsh and oxygenating the sediments, are we going to be inhibiting denitrification rates? And that could have major consequences for the nitrogen removal capacity of the marsh. So stay tuned for next year's research at the reserve for those results. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that we need runnels in Doghead, and also that runnels are a successful restoration strategy, because in December of 2023, our permits came through and we installed our 5 runnels. This project was done in conjunction with mosquito control, who also have interest in draining that water to reduce mosquito breeding ground. We had a large number of volunteers, including my 3-month-old who supervised us, and then Megan Tyrell, the research coordinator here at Waquoit. Here's a couple more pictures. This is Wendy Ferguson, who's kind of the local runnel expert. She works for Rhode Island Save the Bay and has installed a number of successful runnel projects in Rhode Island and is helping now in Massachusetts. This picture here is a picture. We also did a little bit of ditch remediation. So those ditch plugs that I was talking about, we were able to go in and clear those up to help just continue to restore that natural flow of the water. And this is a picture of a couple of these runnels. You can see they really vary in, I know you can't see the length of some of them, but they really do vary in length, but not much in size. They're very shallow and skinny. We employ a couple different techniques to ensure that we're not over draining. So one of those techniques is this S shape. This is one of our longest runnels. And so to avoid a situation where we are completely draining the water off really quickly, which will take any unconsolidated sediment with it, which is, sediment's good. We don't want to drain it too fast. So we can do that by creating this S shape. We can also install a sill, which is not pictured here, but basically just a little speed bump at the end of the runnel before it drains into the creek channel. Again, this just helps slow that water drainage off the marsh so it's not going too quickly. So here's a picture of the pool in August 2023, and here we are, February 2024, just 2 months after the runnel was installed. And no, we did not kill all the vegetation. It's just what marshes look like in the winter. But you can see, and it is a little bit difficult to see, but there's a lot of bare sediment here that didn't exist before the runnel was installed. Here's a little bit of a close-up picture. I don't have a before from this exact angle, but a lot of this bare sediment that we're now seeing didn't exist before the runnels were installed. So we have successfully drained part of these pools, and so we're really hoping that we'll see some revegetation, hopefully this summer. And if you don't believe me from the pictures, we'll look at the data. So these are data from our water level logger in that first pool picture that I showed you. And so the blue line is just the average low water level. This is the lowest amount of water in the pool on certain low tides. And so on average, before the runnel was installed, there was about 25 centimeters of water at its lowest point. But after the runnel was installed, that number went down to 18 centimeters. So we reduced the standing water on the marsh in the middle of that channel, remember, is by 7 centimeters. So it's pretty exciting to see. And so what's next? So we are going to be doing a phase 2, a cleaning and deepening of the runnel. So as I mentioned, we are trying to have a delicate balance between drainage, but not over drainage. And so we dig them a little bit shallower than they maybe need to be. And every time we're out there, we look at them, we clean them out, make sure that they're still draining properly. But this spring, we're going to be doing a more extensive cleaning and deepening to just ensure that they're getting proper drainage before the summer season. And we will continue monitoring the water level, sediment characteristics, vegetation changes, the nitrogen cycle, and decomposition. And this is just a timeline for what that looks like. We did our baseline measurements in 2023, which will serve as our baseline to tell how things change once the runnels are installed. They were installed this winter. We'll do our cleaning in the spring and then take our year 1 post-runnel measurements in the summer, 2024. So ultimately, the goals of this project and of our project is to understand the efficacy of runnels, to understand more deeply how they're changing a lot of these sediment characteristics, vegetation changes, nitrogen cycling processes, et cetera. And we hope that these data will influence policy and help streamline permitting. Right now, the permitting process is intense and really long. And so my hopes are is if we can continue to show how successful these runnels are and provide data to policymakers, that we can have a more widespread implementation that will help us restore and protect these marshes. And so I did just want to point out that this was not a solo effort. We have a very large team of people behind me helping with experimental design and permitting, including Megan from Webner and some folks from Cape Cod Mosquito Control, Wenley Ferguson, Save the Bay, and then my advisors and some volunteer students. So I think with that, yeah, take some questions.
We have people here in person, but have cookies and things. And we also have the webinar. So we'll be going back and forth with questions. And if maybe we'll start with the webinar so you guys can think of questions there. So Lori will be looking in the chat box for questions there. So.
Sure, I can kick us off. We have a question from Ray. Where did you put the plugs from digging the runnels?
Yes, good question. We attempted to make some of those high marsh topography for the salt marsh sparrows. And unfortunately, we had a very large storm recently that washed them all away, but that was our intention. So yes, they were placed on the salt marsh platform.
All right, I have another question, Joan, if you'd like me to go.
Okay, and then we have one here too.
Okay. Do you anticipate having to upkeep the runnels every year in perpetuity? Are you working towards figuring out the optimal depth, length, etc., so they last as long as possible while not draining too much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for at least the first 3 to 4 years, they're going to need to be maintained. You know, they are a drainage channel, so things will get washed away into them, and they often do get clogged, which is going to reverse some of what we're trying to do. So yes, I think for a while, they're going to need to be maintained. Maintenance is relatively quick and easy, right? If you're already out there, you just check on them, dig a little bit, remove any clogs. So yeah, I mean, ideally, we should work towards a more standardized method for maintaining these, but every marsh is different and every drainage system is different. And so it is going to take a little bit of on the ground continuous monitoring and maintenance.
Is the chemistry of the organic nitrogen compound going into and the organic carbon going into CO2, are those coupled in a way that you can't uncouple them?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, are the nitrogen compounds for denitrification and then the carbon compounds coupled? Yeah, they are, yes, and you can't uncouple them. Denitrification often uses that organic matter as an electron source for denitrification.
I know you're still waiting for results of vegetation for this year. In your spatial study for any sites that have been runnels for a couple of years now, is there any story with what colonizes first in the plant community? Are you seeing high marsh plant species come in yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, what types of vegetation recolonize first after the runnels have the water is drained? So for my spatial study, I think I was a little too far out in terms of they've already been, installed. But I know Alice Besterman, who did the Buzzards Bay study with runnels, found that forbs, so not the high marsh grasses, but a different species of plants. And I'm not totally up on my summer's all my vegetation, but the forbs colonized first, and then spartina alterniflora, and then those high marsh grasses. So she has a really nice figure in a paper that shows kind of the evolution and the phases of different vegetations.
Lori, we have more questions here, but do you want to take one from the chat box?
Sure. This is a follow-up from Ray about digging the runnels. If the plugs were put along the edge of the pond, would it help reestablish grass growth in the drain pond?
If they were put along, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I think I would be hesitant to disrupt the hydrology more than, we're trying to restore it. And I think I would be worried that if we put a lot of plugs in, you might inadvertently alter the hydrology more. But that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that.
Thank you, Hillary. That was great. So I have a two-parter. The first part is, what to you has been the most sort of exciting result so far? I know you still have work, more of the research to come. And then the other side of that is, what has been the most difficult part?
Okay, the question was, what has been the most exciting result and what's been the most difficult part? I'll start with the difficult part. The difficult part is honestly the permitting and the implementation, because it's a very, like, we dug the runnels in a couple hours, right? It's a very cheap, easy method that is very proven to show signs of improving our restoration. So I think that's been a little bit frustrating, is kind of overcoming some of those hurdles to implement something that really can help save these marshes. The coolest thing was when we dug the runnels and like came back and saw actual drainage, and then just standing at the end of the runnel watching it drain out. Like that, there's nothing better than watching something that you've been planning and spent 9 months waiting on permits to implement it, and to actually see it working in real time was pretty cool. Yeah.
Do you have any? Lori, do you have any chat box questions?
I have a few. First one is why not drain out more water from the chosen ponds?
Yeah, so I think the goal is to eventually drain most of the water. I think in Doghead Marsh, some of those ponds are just too big. I don't think they're ever going to fully drain. If you remember that picture from the Buzzards Bay runnels, those did fully drain. And as I've kind of been mentioning, we do want to retain some moisture in that sediment. Because we don't want to disrupt that balance and increase decomposition and carbon emissions to the atmosphere. And then we also want to maintain denitrification, which helps remove nitrogen. So again, it's kind of, and these salt marsh grasses actually need some moisture to survive. They don't want to be completely dried out all the time. So yeah, so the goal is to essentially always drain an entire pond, but that's not always feasible, just depending on size.
Okay.
And do another one? Oh, we
Sure.
have one here. Okay, go ahead, Nikki.
I want to know, my two-parter question is, how do you feel having dug the first runnels on Cape Cod? And secondly, how do you feel about how your permit is being used as an example to alleviate the permitting process?
Yeah, yes. I am very proud that this is the first runnel project on Cape Cod, and I am excited that it's going to hopefully kickstart and streamline some of the permitting hurdles that we are facing in Massachusetts. So yeah, it's a good feeling. Yeah.
Well, I think this next question online actually ties in with that. Is this salt marsh research being coordinated with, or could it be applied to benefit the salt marsh research / restoration being done as part of the Herring River Restoration Project in Wellfleet? So that probably ties in with what you just said.
Yes, yeah, I'm not that familiar with that project, but this is definitely something that could be installed anywhere, anywhere that these pools meet the criteria for successful drainage. So I'm not that familiar with the Herring project, but I know that there's a project in the Plum Island project is doing a lot more than just runnels. They're doing a lot of different hydrology kind of manipulations to help restore hydrology in general. So yes, I think it can be used as like a part tool to help other projects complete their goals.
Okay, one from the room.
So Hillary, you mentioned the permitting challenge a number of times. And so what is the biggest, I know it's not just one, but what is the biggest constraint that the permitters have? Why they're not trying to make your life difficult or others if they want to. So
Yeah.
what is the biggest concern that they're trying to work through? And then secondly, have any of those sort of regulators sort of come to observe this first run on Cape Cod, and are they going to sort of be keeping tabs on it, just sort of learn from it?
Yeah. So the question was, why is the permitting process so hard? And then have any regulators come to observe this project or similar projects? I think the permitting process is hard because you're dredging or digging into a wetland, and wetlands are protected in Massachusetts from development and construction, right? So I think the state is rightly worried about letting people just go dig in the marsh. So yes, that's the answer to the first question. And second question, Regulators have become a lot more interested in these projects. They have become more interested in the results, in the success. We had someone from the state Department of Environmental Protection come do the site visit, and he's the one that approved the permit, and he'll be following us and we'll be submitting reports to him. And he has a big say in helping streamline the permitting process. So I think it's getting kickstarted. I just think it's slow.
How much intersection is there between not what you're doing with the runnels particularly, but what you're studying? And for example, the Coonamessett River restoration, where they turned the cranberry bogs back into wetlands. Is there a lot to be exchanged?
You're testing my knowledge. I don't really know. The person you should talk to after is Haley.
And is it local conservation commissions, or is it the state that's the problem, or both?
It's the state that we have to go through to get our permits for wetland projects. Yeah.
Lori, do you have?
I do. I have two questions left online. One is from Glenn. What keeps the water from flowing in the opposite direction through the runnels, flooding the pools in the event of extreme high tides or storms?
Nothing. It definitely happens. You know, you can see that here we had some really, really high storms. And so the low tide was really high, and that's after the runnel was installed. So nothing. The idea there is that it's not actually increasing the amount of water coming on the marsh. It's just helping remove it once it does get on the marsh.
And I think this is, oh, Ray wants you to explain what is the difference between a salt pan and ponding?
Yeah, so I don't know the technical definitions. In my understanding, salt pans are areas where the vegetation has died, but there's not necessarily any pooled standing water. And that can cause forbs and other different types of vegetation to grow. But they maybe aren't sinking like the ponds and pools are, right? So maybe they are still have firm sediment. I think salt pans turn eventually into pools if they continue to degrade and erode, and just the standing water will eventually begin to pool. So it's kind of like the first step before a pool.
Thank you. I have one more.
Okay, go ahead.
You sure? Okay. For Michael, congratulations on an important effort and thank you for an excellent presentation. Given the rather ominous projections for sea level rise, where do you see the vitality of marshes in the next decade or 2 decades?
Well, if you think back to the slide where I highlighted the rates of sea level rise, I have faith that because right now the rates of sea level rise are low enough that the majority of marshes are able to withstand sea level rise by accreting sediment and you know, keeping up that elevation in relation to sea level rise. So I am hopeful, but it is concerning that we're now starting to see this emergence on the upper platform of these bare areas of shallow standing water. So I'm going to be a hopeful person and hope that we can buy some time with some of these remediation strategies. It's obviously not going to solve sea level rise problems, but we'll do what we can.
In the room here? Anybody else in the chat box?
I think you've answered everybody we have here. Thank you.
So I just want to do a little blurb for next week. Sure. And then thank Hillary for an excellent presentation. So next week we will be having Into the Swamp and Baywatchers Metaverse. And in case you're not sure what that means, we have a system-wide monitoring program at all the research reserves around the country. And we have one right here as well. So we're doing water quality monitoring. And we also have Baywatchers, which is a volunteer water quality monitoring program here in Waquoit Bay. And Theo Collins, our research associate who oversees both of these programs, will be looking back and what we found here, and also, you know, telling you how we do it, and some information on that. So it's quite a long data set. It's been over 2 decades long. And so we invite you to come in person if you want, or also we'll be doing it also on the webinar as well. So next week. And I just want to give a
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good job, Hal.